They wouldn't even give 24 hours of rest to the soldiers coming from the trenches who had marched all night. They weren't in that much of a hurry. And first of all, where were we going? Nobody knew exactly, but we had a premonition, according to certain rumours, that we were going to take part in an imminent big offensive. On April 4th, we left Bro-Saint-Cohier, and after a 25-kilometre march, we billeted at Somme-Yèvre. On the 5th, we took up our march again, passing through several small villages which all resembled one another, from Dommartin-sur, this to Somme-sur, that, and after having covered 25 kilometres like the day before, we billeted in the pretty little village of Vésigneul-sur-Marne, southeast of Châlons. Along our route, when we passed through one village, the population pressed forward to see us go by. On the faces you could read the pity. One woman called out, "Oh, the poor fellows! When will this life of hardships be over?" Maybe it was a mother whose own son was in the furnace. In the corner of the village square we noticed a peasant with long hair and a greying beard, standing immobile as if at attention, holding his cap out to us in a broad gesture of salute. He had a look for each of us, a look of sad farewell. This sincere salute, full of sympathy for the men being led to sacrifice, moved us profoundly. In another village, there was a group of children marching in formation with a leader at their head, like soldiers, and they made quite a disharmonious racket with their rattles. That's how we learned it was Good Friday. The bell towers were silent, and the children were calling the faithful to church services. We passed near Chalons-sur-Marne, and finally, after a long and rough march, we reached the momentary goal of our journey, Aulnay-sur-Marne, 12 kilometres northwest of Châlons, on the road to Épernay. In this village, the Germans had blown up the bridge in their retreat in September 1914. The inhabitants told us that the French engineers built the very sturdy new bridge out of wood in 24 hours. The region of Aulnay must be a paradise for hunters. Rabbits and hares are in abundance. As we crossed the countryside, we could see them in bands of 10 or 12, running, gambolling, frolicking as if they were far from mankind in some virgin forest. Strict orders protected the peace and quiet of these animals. Vigilant gendarmes were on the lookout for those for whom the sight of this game would tempt the appetites and awaken the instincts of the poacher or the hunter. A poilu who let himself get nabbed by the cops with a hare in hand had to give back his prey, and would get the penalty of a month in prison inscribed into his paybook. Our 37mm gun crew was lodged, as usual, in a barn. I set myself up in an empty stable stall, with a big horse on one side and a cow on the other as roommates. One day I discovered by chance a corner where 3 careless hens had roosted and laid their eggs. I shared my discovery with my 2 buddies, Vidal and Castet. Honest and scrupulous, we held a sort of council of war to consider what to do next with this find. It's certain that had they fallen into the hands of other poilus, these eggs would have disappeared into their pockets and haversacks in less time than it takes to write this down, especially since the farm folk weren't very generous and caring toward us. But we handed over these eggs without hesitation, asking only that they sell them to us as a favour. We did the same thing on the following days. The proprietress and her daughter couldn't get over our unselfishness. In exchange, they rendered us all manner of small kindnesses, to the astonishment of our comrades from whom we kept the news of this little event. All of our comrades would have laughed scornfully at our scruples. On April 12th, our departure was announced for the next day, but at the appointed hour, assembled and ready to go, there was a counter-order. So we unexpectedly earned another 24 hours and another good night in a warm stable. 2 days later, the 14th, same orders for departure and same counter-order. But on the 15th, we left Aulnay for good. We passed through Jalons-les-Vignes, where I didn't see even a stump of vigne, vine stocks, and the regiment came to billet at the village of Issa, where we spent just one night. Finding myself in too tight a space in this encampment, I climbed onto a pile of fodder where I slept rather badly, because there were thistles in large number, and their little barbs pricked my skin disagreeably, which left a piercing recollection of Issa, the only one, by the way. The next day, April 16th, the regiment left Issa at dawn, to head for the front where the cannonade was raging. April 16th, ill-fated day, the unleashing of a fruitless, bloody offensive, the slaughterhouse of the Chemin des Dames, where our regiments were decimated and where all the field stations were overflowing with wounded, who were too numerous to be cared for or evacuated. To support the headbutting planned for the Chemin des Dames, the offensive had to be extended all along the Champagne front. As usual, our division wasn't part of the shock troops in the front line. Instead, our job was pursuit and mopping up. That's why, at dawn on the 16th, we were spread out along roads and paths, instead of charging with fixed bayonets at H-hour. At only 3 kilometres from Issa, we halted in the village of Vaudemange. At a crossroads at the entrance to the village, a dozen brave ones from the 1914 Battle of the Marne had found eternal rest in a common grave. We were warned not to make ourselves too comfortable, because at midnight we would be heading up to the front to begin our pursuit of the enemy. At roll call, they read us the order of the day from the mass murderer of April 16th, General Nivelle, to communicate to the troops, or rather to the victims, the day before the attack, among other bits of nonsense, that the hour of sacrifice has sounded, and we can't be bothered by thoughts of home leave. Alas, it was already almost 30 months that the hour of sacrifice had been sounding every day for some poor soul. And as for home leave, in spite of all the orders of the day, or night, that's all the poilus thought about, from morning to evening. Everything else was pushed aside. The reading of this patriotic drivel aroused no enthusiasm at all. To the contrary, it only served to demoralize the soldier who heard in it only a terrible menace, more suffering, great danger, a frightful death, a useless sacrifice, totally in vain. No one had any confidence in this new round of killing leading to any useful result. In fact, our great leaders didn't doubt for an instant that the Germans would be routed. The most minute preparations had been made for a vigorous pursuit of the enemy. Each man received rations for several days, enough containers for 4 litres of drink, grenades by the dozen and cartridges by the 100, with no thought about whether the soldier could carry such a heavy burden. As it happened, many threw aside both meals and munitions to lighten their loads. So much waste due directly to the carelessness of our bosses. Therefore, at midnight, in a very dark night under a driving rain, bent double under the downpour, we left Vaudemange and headed into the fiery furnace. After marching a few kilometres on a good road, we headed off on a path across the fields, with muddy ruts where our caissons got stuck and our mules slid and stumbled. The rain kept pouring down. Our feet slopped along in waterlogged shoes. Finally, at 4 in the morning on the 17th, the dark night began to clear up. They halted us in a wood, a little to the rear of a heavy artillery battery. Right then the rain stopped, and was replaced by snow, which fell in big fat flakes like I'd never seen before. A blizzard on April 17th. While in our midi, down south, the trees would be already in bloom, and the grapevines a sea of green. But it wasn't a mirage. It was indeed a coating of snow that soon covered everything under a white blanket. Our fatigue was such that most collapsed at the bases of trees, in groups of 3 or 4, like animals surprised by a storm, even though we were soaked from head to foot and were shivering with cold. It was just the right time to read and reread General Nivelle's famous Order of the Day. Now that would have brought forth quite a burst of enthusiasm. As for me, I slumped down for 5 minutes, but I got so cold that despite my fatigue, I made the effort to walk around, just to keep myself warm. I felt a grumbling in my stomach, reminding me that I'd had only a light supper the day before. I wanted to scrounge around in my mess bag, but my hands were numb with the cold and couldn't work the buttons. In any case, there wasn't much very appetizing inside. The bread, chocolate, cheese, everything was soaked, pulverized, and rendered inedible by the deluge. Finally, at about 6 a.m., repeated whistle blasts brought all these poor devils, numb with cold, to their feet. To stimulate the courage and the energy of these men with their haggard, downcast looks, it was quickly announced that ahead of us, the first and second enemy lines had been taken in a single burst of elan, and that trench warfare was at an end. As a result, we would now be deploying in open formations. The regiment formed up, and the 3 battalions, spread out into lines by section, marched off. It was superb. The landscape was covered with pine groves, interspersed with large clearings. We were, it appeared, about 4 kilometers from the front lines, but we had just covered 1 kilometer when we got the order to halt. An hour, 2 hours, 3 hours went by, and we were still there. Evidently something wasn't going right. This something turned out to be a German strongpoint bristling with machine guns, upon which shells were having no effect, and which was holding up our advance. Luckily the snow had stopped, and no shells were falling in our vicinity. In the afternoon, by an impossible route, our field kitchen caught up to us. A container of bouillon and one of juice coffee were most welcome. The cooks told us that on all the roads and byways, the regimental supply trains and other convoys sent up for the pursuit had gotten the order to keep their mule teams harnessed, and they were wandering around this way and that, with no idea where to go. Night fell, and the teams stayed where they were until the next day, awaiting orders that never came. Our great leaders had better fish to fry than to worry about poor beasts of burden and their drivers. They forgot about us, too. No orders arrived. There was only the night and a chilling breeze. Our tents gave us precarious shelter. To battle the cold, we had to light fires, but around there all we could find to burn was damp green wood, which threw off a thick, suffocating smoke. Another pretty night engraved on our memories, to think back on when we're safe at home in our own beds, those whom death will spare, that is. The next day, April 18th, we were constantly on alert, not daring to wander off from our positions. But no orders came our way, only rain, falling in buckets. Then another long night, shivering under our fragile tent cloths, which the rain penetrated with ease. April 19th, the same uncertainty, same waiting. But fate had it that I would witness a conversation between our Colonel Robert and a general on horseback, who told him, "Colonel, it's your regiment's turn to move up and attack. Head for the front line right away." Our colonel yanked the pipe from his mouth, let fly a stream of saliva, and to my great amazement, replied deliberately in a gruff voice, "General, look at these men and the state they're in. Do you think they don't know they've run into an insurmountable obstacle? The first day they could have marched ahead, but not now, and me neither." Not many colonels would have had the courage to make this kind of reply, to spare the lives of his men, but under his rude, brusque, grumpy exterior, Colonel Robert hid a good, generous, and compassionate heart. He was indeed a rare soul. I thought that the general would be enraged by this formal refusal of an order, but he wasn't at all. "Oh well, if your men are too tired, go off and let them rest in some nearby village." Indeed, at 3 in the afternoon, we marched off happily to the village of Septso, just 3 kilometers away. This was a good-sized village, to the rear of Prosnes, only 5 kilometers from the front lines. In spite of that, most of the houses were intact and a few inhabitants were still around. It was one of the quietest sectors. The Russians had occupied it for quite a while. An old woman sowing potatoes in her garden told me that for 13 months not one shell had fallen on the village, but for the past 2 weeks they had fallen almost daily. The day after our arrival, we were taking our evening meal peacefully in the courtyard of our billet when a couple of shells fell on the village. It wasn't our neighbourhood which was watered, so we didn't upset our table for such a minor inconvenience. Table is just a figure of speech, since our table was the pavement of the courtyard. We soon learned that these shells had claimed just one victim, Commandant Kos, killed instantly just as he was dressing down a sentry. This senior officer, carrying out vague and useless functions, seemed to spend all his time enforcing petty rules and with mean-spirited tricks, making everyday discipline even more difficult to bear. Recently, while we were passing through the village, he surprised one of our gunners who had the wild audacity to quit ranks to buy a cigar at a tobacco shop. He blew this up into a story without end, declaring that it warranted no less than a full week in prison, and the same punishment for the first non-com who followed us for not closing up ranks to fill the space left by our cigar-loving comrade. The news of his death didn't spark the slightest hint of sympathy among anyone. "So much the worse for him," said one. "If he hadn't stopped to chew out that sentry, this wouldn't have happened to him." "Good riddance, that's one less," others called out. It was with just such indifference and scorn that welcomed the news of the death of officers who had made no effort to win the sympathy of the soldiers. For once, jolly old man Death had spared the little guy and tripped up the proud and arrogant big shot. Alas, that very evening at 9 p.m., I was just settling in when a volley of shells crashed down upon the village, and a projectile landed right on the roof of a house where a section of the 22nd Company was billeted. The roof and a section of wall collapsed, burying 3 soldiers who had already gone to bed. If that shell had fallen a few seconds later, it would have killed as many soldiers as were bunked there. More volleys landed during the night, troubling our sleep. That soured us, so you can imagine how we welcomed with joy the news that we would be evacuating the village that very day. At noon, in small bunches, we left Septso, following the Marne Canal, where we saw the artillerymen who, during the night, moved up to fire on the enemy's rear lines. After a half-hour's march, we reached the main road from Reims to Châlons. Here, the canal passed through a tunnel, which, I was told, was 2.5 kilometers long, and so straight that you can see all the way from one end to the other. We soon left this road to climb up Mont Billy. We passed right next to an immense artillery ammunition depot. There were thousands and thousands of shells of every caliber, lined up like monstrous insect larvae, which one day would burst forth in a blast of fire and brimstone. It's certain that each new offensive made all the munitions manufacturers even richer. There were several millions francs worth, right there. As Anatole France has written, "You may think you're dying for the fatherland, but you're really dying for the industrialists." What was inconceivable was that the Germans had never fired one cannon shot onto this munitions dump, nor had an airplane dropped a bomb which would have been enough to blow the whole depot sky high. And it was right in the path of the German planes which often flew over on their way to bombard Chalon-sur-Marne, Mourmelon, etc. One might have said that in this war of extermination of whole peoples, there was a tacit accord between the warring parties not to destroy munitions. On the other side of the mountain, or rather the mound, stands the village of Billy-le-Grand, where they billeted us. I don't know if there is a Little Billy, but Big Billy, in spite of its flattering qualifier of big, wasn't more than a hamlet, and our battalion had a hard time fitting into it. Our 37mm gun team ended up in a stable, already occupied by some rear echelon horses. As was only fair, we put them outside to make room for us. If the animals were, like us, prone to egoism and meanness, they would have looked at us with hatred, but they didn't even seem to understand. Oh, beasts, how superior you are to us in so many ways. You'll remember that my team's field gun was smashed to marmalade during the Maison Champagne business on April 25th. I got the order to make my way to Chalon-sur-Marne with the gun's driver, my buddy Vidal, to go to the Army's artillery park and get a shiny new 37mm cannon. 22 kilometers separated Billy-le-Grand from the chief town of the Marne department, here Chalon-sur-Marne, where we arrived at 5 in the afternoon. We went to try out the hospitality of the Chanzy artillery barracks to spend the night there. They were willing to grant us, for sleeping, a huge stable, empty of horses. But for our supper, they wouldn't spare us a bowl of soup or a crust of bread. We had to dig into our pocketbooks and shell out 4 francs for a meagre supper in a restaurant. To our great astonishment, the town was bursting with soldiers wearing armbands and patches of every colour, all manner of kepis, sleeve stripes and service ribbons, silver and gold insignia, shiny shoes and collar tabs. Everyone was strutting about, parading back and forth, crowding the café terraces. With our mud-stained helmets, our dusty greatcoats and trousers, Vidal and I looked like vagabonds, mangy dogs, party crashers in the midst of all these fine embusqués. Embarrassed, we slunk along the walls. The next morning we set out for the artillery park to take delivery of our new cannon. We found the place, but alas, there was only one cannon without flèches, arrows or trails extending out behind the gun carriage, that is to say, without a gun carriage. A syringe would have been just as useful as this kind of bronze cylinder. "I advise you to take it," said the ordnance officer to me. "As soon as any flèches turn up, we'll send them to you. If not, you run the risk of not having a cannon at all for a long time." I resigned myself to taking back this half-cannon. But what would Lieutenant Lorius say when I got back, especially if he had taken a few too many swigs of hooch? He was entirely capable, in a fit of anger, of kicking me off the gun crew. And if I arrived empty-handed, with nothing at all, wouldn't that be worse? We set our departure from Chalons for 10 o'clock in the morning. Before leaving, we would have enjoyed a bit of breakfast, but in these strange times, an obscure rule authorized soldiers to get food and drink only between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. The cheapskate restaurateurs, in this era of huge profits, wouldn't run the risk of bending the rules to be nice to two poilus from the trenches. Having done all we could, we decided to go see the canteen keeper at the Chanzy barracks. But hardly had we made our request when she responded with astonishment, as if we were asking her for the moon. Impossible. Don't you know that the canteen is off limits until 11 a.m.? The evening before, we had bought a litre of wine at a bistro across the street, and the proprietress seemed friendly enough. We bought a couple of eggs and went and asked this wine merchant to cook them for us, but alas, we got the same inflexible answer. We were just about resigned to swallowing our eggs raw. But a woman who happened to be at the bistro offered to take us to her place, where, an alluring prospect, we'd be well received and taken care of. It wouldn't have taken us too much to give this woman a kiss on both cheeks, despite her uncertain age. From the rear she appeared to be around 25, in profile about 30, and face to face at least 3 dozen. Her hair was a mess, the early morning hour was an excuse to be sure, and her blouse was far from clean. Well, those were just minor details. What was important was that we were going to have a nice breakfast. She led us down a street as narrow as a communication trench and took us into a low-standing house with grey, cracked walls, made of wobbly, bare stones. This was her abode. We stepped into a cramped room where hopeless disorder reigned, as well as enough filth to dampen the appetite of even our friend Fraisse himself. The table seemed to be perpetually set and never cleared. Glasses, platters, plates were piled up, seemingly unwashed for a fortnight. This woman picked up a skillet which a mangy dog and a scrawny cat had just licked clean, and without even bothering to wipe it off, cracked our eggs right into it. At the sight of this, my buddy Vidal declared that he wasn't hungry anymore and felt a bit of indigestion coming on. As for me, I admitted that I too was feeling unwell, which took away my appetite. The woman, dumbfounded, claimed the eggs for herself and her ragged little kid, who had just come in. Meanwhile, she rambled on in friendly banter with us. She confided that she was burdened with an old and bad-tempered husband of 60, who could never bring himself to laugh, while she still felt young, etc. We couldn't listen to this any more, and we cleared out, not before promising this busybody that we would be happy to be her guests the next time we were in Chalons. That day, we dined on a piece of bread and a can of sardines. In the evening, without incident, we went back to Billy, where with some worry I presented my half of a cannon to Lieutenant Lorius. The lieutenant, although furious, was willing to listen to my explanations. On the promise they had given me that in a short while they would send us the fleshes we needed, he didn't find fault with me. We had hoped that the complete failure of our great offensive of April 16th would have cured our generals of any idea of trying another one. But that was a misunderstanding of their mentality. Our regiment had lost nothing by waiting. We too had to pay our debt in blood. For 8 days, orders and counter-orders succeeded each other, proving the incoherence which reigned in the upper ranks. One day we learned that the 296th Regiment was attached to such and such an army corps, the such and such division, only to hear at roll call the next day that we were replacing another division which was going to the rear to rest. Abruptly they announced our departure for the front lines that very evening. At the last minute, a telephone call postponed this departure to the next day, and then the next day, and then the day after. One morning, the squad leaders left in a hurry to reconnoitre a sector that we were to occupy the following night, but the orderlies stumbled over each other to bring them back. We were now assigned to another sector. This disarray of command, these uncertainties, had a negative effect on the soldiers' spirits, and we were all in a state of depressed morale. But does anyone pay attention to what a soldier thinks and feels? When the order comes to march, to attack, whether you're depressed or not, who would dare to resist, to refuse? One day Colonel Robert had assembled his officers for a conference when an officer from headquarters all buffed, waxed and polished, dressed to the nines, came up, bringing the latest orders. We were to leave for Montcornillé. When the colonel learned about the mission assigned to his regiment, he rose up, eyes flashing furiously, in front of this parade ground officer, and with a voice of thunder he roared to him. I have this directly from the mouth of Lieutenant Lorius. Tell your general that he makes me mad as hell. I've had enough of these orders and counter-orders the past week. Tell him that my regiment is not going to attack until the barbed wire has been blown to bits. Yes, and tell him that if I'm holding them up, let them come and tell me. On April 27th, our battalion left Billy-le-Grand at 1 in the afternoon, and at nightfall we made camp at the village of Courmelois, completely evacuated, half destroyed due to the range of the German guns which, that evening, had the good taste to turn their muzzles elsewhere and leave us alone. The next evening, April 28th, at twilight, the regiment made its way to the village of Wez, not far from the trenches and completely empty of inhabitants, where shells landed daily. The next day, April 29th, the whole regiment moved up to the front lines. Our group left behind an ammo dump at Wez. I had the unexpected good luck to be assigned by Lieutenant Lorius to stay with Jalabert from Narbonne to stand guard over this dump, to assure liaison with field kitchens and our drivers who had halted at Courmelois, and our big caissons stationed with the supply column, as well as with all the other embusqués of the regiment, stationed far back to the rear, near the Issus bridge. But this time the Germans played a nasty trick on all these embusqués, because they were even more heavily bombarded than those who were in Courmelois or Wez. Terrified, some of them didn't hesitate to pull back a full league more of road, to go sleep in the long aqueduct tunnel of Montbilly, in spite of the damp which reigned and the chilly draughts which poured through. My buddy Jalabert and I were installed in the near-deserted village, in a house which was miraculously intact, none other than the parsonage. No piece of furniture of any value remained. Religious paintings hung on all the walls. Crosses, statues of the Virgin and saints were stacked in every corner, and a profusion of Bibles, books about the lives of saints, etc. Enough to convert an army of pagans. Installed like a couple of bourgeois, lounging comfortably in the beds of the curate and his housekeeper, was enough to make us feel ashamed, to be so well off when our comrades were doing so badly. Nevertheless, our repose was disturbed by more and more frequent bombardments which fell upon Wez, where we were soon practically all by ourselves. One night, 2 shells of respectable calibre landed right on the house next door. That was a bit too close for comfort. In the middle of the parsonage garden, surrounded by debris and trash, stood the statue of the Virgin, barely grazed by shrapnel. Was it the Mother of Christ who was protecting this house, where not one shell had yet landed? It was possible, but just to be safe, from this night on, we went to bed prudently in a shelter which some foresighted poilus had set up next to the house, and this in spite of the rats as big as wooden shoes, and lice like grains of wheat which infested this shelter. But you have to choose between the lesser of 2 evils. The rolling field kitchens were moving up at night, not without danger, near the trenches. Our roles consisted of, for Jalabert, getting wine, tobacco, and other provisions to the men of our group who were up on the line, which suited Jalabert just fine, as it permitted him to go to the villages in the rear to live it up, drink, and test the virtue of one or another pretty champagne girl. As for me, I had only to make my way quietly to Courmelois to gather our provisions, which we then prepared and cooked ourselves. Quietly, in a manner of speaking, that is, since sometimes a few shells would fall upon the road where, by daylight, passers-by were scarce, and upon Courmelois, which I had to cross through, the field kitchens being stationed in a thickly wooded park at the far end of the village. I then had to cross a marshy area where you could get stuck in the watery mud up to your knees, but where the German gunners, suspecting that only inoffensive toads and frogs were there, would never aim their fire. But while we were living the easy life, what was our regiment up to? An offensive, combined with a division which was to engage on our right, was fixed for April 30th at 7 a.m. It was postponed to 12:40 p.m. During the morning, our Colonel Robert, standing in front of his dugout, was mortally wounded in the head by a shell fragment and died that very day at the field hospital. This death brought profound emotion in the regiment, but at that time, in such a furnace, we barely had the time to mourn. Everyone was too worried about his own fate. So at the appointed hour, the 296th Regiment surged forward, and with almost no resistance, it reached in a single bound the third line of German trenches. But whether the occupants of those trenches had been massacred by our artillery, or they had gotten away, we scooped up only about 100 prisoners who were hiding in the sturdiest shelters. We would have advanced even farther, but to our right, the 47th Regiment was halted by the machine guns of a strongpoint which could only be taken after several days. The next day, May 1st, the Germans counter-attacked several times, led by teams of grenadiers. We had to yield some of the terrain we had gained, and at one point the munitions were starting to run short. The Germans kept pressing forward, capturing some isolated groups. The situation was becoming serious. In these circumstances, Lieutenant Guillot, commanding the 13th Company, gave proof of sang-froid and coolness bordering on the superhuman. In the midst of general disarray, he took command of the units at hand, and in shirt-sleeves, brandishing a rifle, he led his men, electrifying them, and charged the Germans, pushing them back from position after position. Finally, we stood as masters of the first two enemy trench lines, and the opposing positions were definitively fixed. To the left of Montcornillé, the 296th Regiment had pushed back, or advanced, if you wish, the French border by 500 metres. Our generals should have been satisfied. What importance did the loss of human life have? What counted was being able to feed the dispatches, to maintain what they called the activity at the front, to dazzle the fat-bellied civilian patriots in the rear with the accounts of their exploits. Having pushed the Germans back a few hectometers, that was heroic and brilliant enough. That was a great victory. In reality, it was a useless massacre. Oh, what kind of executioner's soul you had to be a general, to order such killings for nothing, for the amour-propre of the big bosses, for a trumped-up national pride. One evening, a sizable work detail from the 14th Company was carrying munitions up to the front line when a shell landed nearby and set off some cases of grenades. There were 15 men killed or wounded. Captain Miquel from Béziers was among the dead. The Germans, having decimated our troops at the Chemin des Dames, brought up masses of artillery against us. They fired furiously upon our lines. It became worse than Verdun. I saw one soldier carried off, raving mad. The lieutenant commanding the 17th Company lost his wits and had to be evacuated. Right beside us, the 47th Regiment, which had ended up taking, or rather encircling, the German strongpoint, wasn't able to capture all the defenders, who sought refuge in the underground corridors, no doubt expecting to be rescued in a counterattack by their own side. We blocked up all the exits with walls of sandbags, and threw asphyxiating grenades into the strongpoint, which henceforth stood as silent as a tomb. Oh, isn't war fine to behold? The ones who did that gave it no more thought than would hunters smoking a fox or a marten out of its burrow. One day, to my bad luck, Sergeant Gauthier, the head of our gun team, fell sick. He had colic, simple colic, indigestion from undercooked beans. When an offensive was on, it wouldn't do for a soldier, not to mention a non-com, to be sick in his belly, stomach, throat, or any other organ. That would be suspicious. So Sergeant Gauthier thought it prudent to not go to sick call, but rather asked Lieutenant Lorius for the authorization, which was granted to him, to go rest up for 2 or 3 days back with the field kitchens. The result? Orders for Corporal Barthas on May 6th to replace Sergeant Gauthier at the 37mm gun. I had to yank myself away from our tranquil life, our cosy lodgings, and a nice bed, a real bed, to go to the slopes of that sinister Montcornillé, which was smoking like a terrible erupting volcano. I didn't know the sector, and I received the order to present myself to the dugout of our officer at Les Marquises. The road that ran in front of the Wes parsonage would take me right there. But it was highly imprudent to venture onto the road during the day, at which time it was completely deserted, because it was within easy firing range of the German cannon. At night, however, or during part of it at least, you could circulate there in almost complete safety, And this road, crisscrossed by hundreds of vehicles of every kind, was teeming with life, noise, and movement. The Germans, too, needed to feed themselves, and there was a tacit agreement between the two artilleries that they wouldn't fire on the roads at night. During this time, the cannon weren't idle. They fired without respite upon the enemy trenches, instead of on the roads. Oh, what nights of horror for the poor sacrificial victims, the martyrs who had to live and die there. By noon, no horseman or bicyclist or pedestrian had yet appeared on the road. I had resigned myself to heading out alone when I finally saw 2 machine gunners carrying ammunition, and I joined up with them. As we left Wes, the road crossed an empty, desolate plain, without the slightest rise in ground to take shelter behind, in case of bombardment. That gave you quite a chill to head out into open country, at the mercy of the simplest 77. It's true, the road was camouflaged. That's to say that some drapes of grey cloth suspended from telegraph poles protected passers-by from the enemy's view. But the shells had, in many places, opened huge gashes and breaches in the cloth, which weren't very reassuring. At the end of this plain, where the most complete solitude reigned, the road entered a wood where we could see green branches. But we observed with distress that the Germans were bombarding this wood, which seemed to be on fire. There were a number of French batteries hidden in it. When we arrived at the wood's edge, we stopped, terrified. Enormous, monstrous shells, more terrible than lightning bolts, were tearing up, shredding, decapitating giant 100-year-old trees. We saw them wrenched from the ground, twisted and broken, as if by a giant cyclone. The whole forest seemed to be complaining, groaning, cracking under the blows of a Titan's cudgel. Suddenly, from every corner of the wood, we saw artillerymen of the 47th Regiment, 2nd Battery, fleeing as if they had the Germans right on their coattails. "We've been sold out, betrayed," they said. "As soon as we change our positions and camouflage them, they're targeted and bombarded." Just then, fearing that some shell or other would blow up their ammo supplies, they had given the traditional order of every man for himself. Lucky artillerymen who could skedaddle at the first sign of danger. It wasn't like that for us, the poor infantrymen, who were never granted the right to turn their backs to the enemy. Nevertheless, these gunners having assured us that right then no one was shelling the road itself, we entered the wood. This information wasn't quite true. Some fairly recent craters, their edges still black with powder, were somewhat numerous along the sides and even in the middle of the road. The territorial road menders would have plenty of work the next night to put the road back into shape. Crossing the wood involved a span of barely a kilometre, but we were in such a hurry to get out of there that this kilometre seemed longer than a league. Finally, panting, gasping, out of breath, we reached the other side. Right there stood a roadkeeper's cabin torn open by a shell blast. We caught our breaths for a minute in an adjacent pedestrian shelter. At this place we left the Prunay road for that of Les Marquises, a hamlet or a chateau of which nothing more was left than a pile of rubble. We arrived there after a half-hour's suffocating walk along a boyau. Les Marquises was the terminus for the mobile field kitchens each evening, and also the site of munitions and equipment depots. There were some reserve units there, as well as the shelter of the colonel, on the doorstep of which Colonel Robert had been killed. Someone pointed out to me a pile of ruins which, he assured me, belonged to the beautiful and famous Madame Steinheil, in whose arms, so the story went, had died a president of the Republic. At Les Marquises passed the main road from Reims to Saint-Menehould and Metz, called the Roman Road. Shelters had been dug under the roadway, and it was in one of them that I found our officer, who had me accompanied up to the emplacement where our team was posted, about 500 metres toward Montcornillet, which looked to me like a whitish shape, the shells having completely overturned and scraped clean the topsoil and laid bare the layer of clay underneath. I found my comrades entrenched a few metres from our former front line, in a rather deep shelter, at the bottom of which was a little square space filled with mortar rounds that they'd seemed to have forgotten about. It was nothing more than a simple flight of stairs, down into the ground, where you could very easily be buried alive if a shell collapsed the entryway. This fear wasn't completely imaginary, since a shell exploding nearby had thrown up against the entrance a big pile of dirt and had almost completely blocked it up. Luckily, those inside were armed with picks and shovels and could dig themselves out. Nevertheless, even as it was, this shelter was a precious and coveted refuge. With bombardments like these, all the shelters would collapse one by one, and all the men who were crouched in the bits of boyau waited for nightfall during the day and for daybreak during the night, and always waited for either death or relief. I've said that by day, the German batteries fired on the roads, the woods, and the villages, but by night they concentrated their fire on the trench lines, knowing that in night-time the men were obliged to bring up the rations, go on work details, reliefs, etc. At any moment, each night, men on work details, liaison duties, ration trips, surprised in our vicinity by frightful barrages, came to seek refuge in our hospitable dugout, bunching up thickly in our staircase. We couldn't even think of getting a minute of sleep there, but it would have been mean-spirited to complain, when others not only weren't getting any sleep, but were stuck outside in a storm of steel and fire. One morning I saw appear, framed in the doorway of our shelter, the silhouette of our Sergeant Gautier, who had finally digested his beans and come back to rejoin his post. On the double quick, I yielded my place back to him and headed out to Wes, with no regrets. Looking back, I had hardly played any sort of glorious role at Montcornillais, where our field gun stood mounted in a shell crater, its menacing mouth fixed on the edge of a wood, where those lucky Boches took advantage of the abundant cover these woods provided. Our gun had to fire only when an attack was on. The Germans much preferred to pound us with their marmites, heavy shells, than to undertake bayonet duels with the Frenchmen, so I could spend my sojourn in that area as a simple spectator. At Wes, I met up with my friend Jalabert, who welcomed me with great joy, as complete solitude reigned in the village which was bombarded more and more frequently. All that remained at Wes was an outpost of 2 artillery spotters at the top of the church tower. These artillerymen figured that the Germans used this tower as a range-finding reference point. Otherwise, they would have already knocked it down like a bowling pin. Each day, the men on the front line anxiously awaited their relief. They were at the limit of their strength. But our implacable bosses didn't want to grant them relief, as long as they had not yet reached, as in all the offensives, the expected percentage of losses. Exasperated and in despair, some men surrendered to the Germans, and some Germans surrendered to the French. What cowards, say the patriots in the rear. But if all the soldiers on both sides had done the same thing, wouldn't that have been sublime? The generals would have had to fight each other. Poincaré could have gone a couple of rounds in the boxing ring with the Kaiser. That would have been hilarious. My comrade Sabatier from Rieux-Minervois, whom I've referred to several times in this account, was taken prisoner with a colleague while heading out to occupy a forward listening post. Poor Sabatier, now dead as I write these lines, illiterate and simple of spirit, had, like so many others, never understood why we were at war. Nobody asked his advice in declaring it, so he didn't ask anyone's permission to slip over to the Germans. "Your war's over," the Boche told him when Sabatier and his buddy fell into their trench. That's all they were asking for. Finally, on May 15th, the regiment, having poured out its share of blood and paid its tribute in suffering to the hydra of war, the 296th was relieved on the night of May 15th to 16th and went to billets in the village of Issa. No official numbers of losses, or unofficial ones, were issued, of course, but according to reliable sources, the regiment marked its passage by leaving 150 dead on the slopes of Montcornillais, 100 more missing, and counted around 350 wounded. Private Babou of the 13th Company, from Narbonne, had his own son as his sergeant. It took wartime to produce such a paradox, a father forced to passively obey his own son. The very day that the regiment went up to the front line, our Colonel Robert had the generous thought to hold back in reserve the men of the oldest conscript year classes, who would rejoin their units only when any attacks or counter-attacks were completed. When Babou Senior rejoined his half-section, he no longer found his sergeant, that is, his son, who had been killed in a German counter-attack. He didn't even have the consolation of seeing where his son's body had been left in enemy hands. If our poor colonel had, like all the other colonels, marched everyone forward, the father and son might have both been killed side by side. Ah, this damned war. At dawn on May 20th, the 296th Regiment left Issa and took the road to Chalons-sur-Marne. This was a Sunday, but those whose slaves we were didn't care about that, the poilus having been forgotten in the list of beneficiaries of a weekly day of rest. It was pretty hot, following the long, dusty road, and we cast an envious eye on the cool shade of the Marne River valley we were marching along. We were quite worn out when we reached the little village of Competrix, a few hundred metres outside Châlons. After the evening meal with a comrade, I took a walk into Châlons. We could hardly find a glass of beer to drink, with the thousands of embusqués soaking it all up each day. Lots of activity in the streets, the embusqués showing off their newest kepis, their brightest stripes and chevrons. Most had on their arms their wives or other women, in flowered hats, corsages, dresses with festive colours. All these fine folk strolling around, smiling, gossiping, flirting in perfect ignorance and tranquillity. Nevertheless, you could hear in the distance the dull sound of the cannon. Over by Montcornillet, the Rocher de Tahur, and the Main de Massige, human blood was flowing. Ambulances quietly brought wounded flesh to the city's hospitals, next to which the cemeteries grew bigger every day. We left the town, heartbroken by this indifference, this selfishness, this forgetfulness which insulted those who were dying, who were suffering in the trenches without even knowing why or how. The next day, at a very early hour, we were on the road, passing through a deserted and silent Châlons. We stopped at the village of Lépine, where we admired a magnificent church, Notre-Dame de Lépine, a destination for pilgrims who come to drink the sacred, holy, miracle-working water from a well located inside the church. Halting in the village right by the walls of this church, quite thirsty and with my canteen dry, I could have easily drunk a whole quart of this precious water, because in the village there was neither a fountain nor a public well. But the church was prudently locked, and I had to beg a glass of water from a housewife who hastened to give it to me, while telling me that water was very tightly rationed around there. Around noon, we arrived at our destination, Somme-Vézelay. Next to the church, you could see the remains of several burned-out houses. The inhabitants told us that when troops were recently billeted in the village, there was a big explosion of grenades in one encampment, which led to the burning down of a group of houses and a part of the church and the bell tower. Sadly, 5 soldiers had been killed. The war was over for them, and they rested in the little flower-filled cemetery surrounding the church. At Somme-Vézelay, the war had left its traces of fire and blood. The next day, May 22nd, after a long march, we billeted at Daucourt, 6 kilometres from Saint-Menehould, the last stop in our latest journey on foot. We stayed at Daucourt for 9 days, resting up from the exertions of our latest offensive, with the usual distractions, parades and reviews both big and small, field exercises which were either wearying or boring. At this time, the Russian Revolution broke out. Those Slavic soldiers, only yesterday enslaved and bent double under the weight of iron discipline, unknowingly marching off to massacres like resigned slaves, had thrown off their yokes, proclaimed their liberty, and imposed peace on their masters, their hangmen. The whole world was stupefied, petrified by this revolution, this collapse of the immense empire of the Tsars. These events had repercussions on the Western Front and throughout the French ranks. A wind of revolt blew across almost all the regiments. There were, besides, plenty of reasons for discontent. The painful failure of the Chemin des Dames offensive, which had no result other than a dreadful slaughter. The prospect of more long months of war ahead, with a highly dubious outcome. And finally, the long wait for home leaves. It's that which bothered the soldiers most, I believe. I cannot pretend to tell the whole story of what happened almost everywhere just then. I will stick to writing what I know regarding our regiment and the repression which followed. There was, at the end of the village, a shopkeeper for whom the war brought only profit. He sold beer, and he had a cute little waitress to serve it to customers. Powerful. But I did decide to give an appearance of legality to these revolutionary demonstrations. I wrote up a manifesto to give to our company commanders, protesting against the delay in furloughs. It began like this. On the eve of the offensive, General Nivelle had read to the troops an order of the day, saying that the hour of sacrifice had rung. We offered our lives and made this sacrifice for the fatherland, but in exchange we said that the hour of home leaves had also sounded a while ago, etc. The revolt was therefore placed squarely on the side of right and justice. The manifesto was read out in a sonorous voice by a poilu who was perched astride the limb of an oak tree. Fervent applause underscored his last lines. My vanity was hardly flattered. If they learned that it was I who had drawn up this protest, moderate as it was, my fate was clear. A court-martial for sure, and possibly 12 Lebel bullets dispatched to send me off to another world, long before my appointed hour. Meanwhile, the officers had taken note of the call for an enormous assembly of soldiers out by the Daucourt washhouses. They tried to interrogate some poilus about the purpose of this meeting, but no one was willing to respond, or they answered evasively. Our commandant tried to block the road by the police station, but the poilus got through by using other routes. In the afternoon, the order was given for immediate departure. It included the formal promise that home leaves would begin again, starting the next day, at a rate of 16 per 100 men. The military authorities, so arrogant and authoritarian, had to capitulate. They needed nothing more to re-establish order. In spite of that, there were lively disturbances, especially in the encampments of the 4th Machine Gun Company, a few moments before departure, and the men headed out only after singing the Internationale, right in the faces of their stupefied but powerless officers. At 3 o'clock, under a brilliant sun, we left Daucourt. At 5 o'clock, the regiment marched through Sainte-Menehould, where tragic events had just played out. 2 regiments had just mutinied and seized their barracks, crying, "Peace or revolution?" General X, who went to try to harangue the mutineers, was grabbed, slammed against a wall, and was just about to be shot, when a much-beloved commandant succeeded in saving the general and winning the promise that the insurgents be allowed to make their way to the camp at Châlons for a long rest. Rifle shots were fired on a group of officers who were trying to approach the barracks. The bullets went wild and hit some innocent victims in the town, killing 2, it is said. They judged it prudent to separate the 3 battalions of the 296th Regiment from one another, and they billeted us fairly far apart. Our battalion was quartered in barracks 4 kilometres from Sainte-Menehould. It was only when we got there that we learned that the other battalions were elsewhere.